Hey there. Welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story, for generations, families living deep in the Appalachian Mountains have shared the same advice with anyone unfamiliar with the region. Respect the mountains, respect the weather. And when night falls, pay attention to what is happening around your home. Most people assume those warnings are about practical dangers, harsh winters, dangerous roads, wildlife. The kind of problems that can be explained, but hidden inside old county records and local newspaper archives are stories that residents rarely discuss outside their own communities. Stories about isolated homes, quiet nights, and moments when ordinary families realized they were not as alone as they believed. One of those stories began during the winter of 2014 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee near the Appalachian border. The Carter family had recently purchased an old farmhouse that had belonged to the same family for nearly 70 years. Thomas and Rebecca Carter were both in their early 60s and had spent most of their lives in a small town outside Knoxville. After retirement, they wanted something quieter, a place surrounded by forests, away from traffic, where they could spend their evenings reading, gardening, and enjoying the slower pace of mountain life. The farmhouse was exactly what they wanted. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel road surrounded by several acres of wooded land. The nearest neighbor lived almost half a mile away. The nearest store was a 20-minute drive, cell service was unreliable, and after sunset, the only lights visible came from the farmhouse windows and the stars above the mountains. Thomas loved the privacy. Rebecca appreciated the quiet. Neither of them considered the isolation unusual. They had spent years visiting rural areas and believed they understood mountain living. The first few months were peaceful. The couple repaired old sections of the house, planted vegetables behind the property, and slowly became familiar with their neighbors. Everyone they met was friendly, but several longtime residents mentioned something about the area that caught Rebecca's attention. They said the mountains had a way of making ordinary sounds seem different at night. A tree branch falling in the forest could sound like footsteps. An animal moving through leaves could sound like someone walking outside. They told her not to panic if she heard strange noises after dark. Rebecca remembered that advice on the night of January 17, 2015. A winter storm had moved through the region earlier that afternoon, covering the surrounding hills with several inches of snow. The power flickered twice before returning, and by 9 o'clock, the entire mountain was unusually quiet. No vehicles passed on the road, no neighbors called. Even the usual sounds of animals moving through the woods seemed absent. Thomas and Rebecca spent the evening watching television before turning in early. Shortly after 11:30, Thomas woke up to a sound he first assumed was caused by the wind. It sounded like something lightly tapping against the front porch. Not a loud knock, not an aggressive sound, just 3 slow taps against the wooden door. He waited several seconds, expecting the noise to stop. Instead, it happened again. 3 taps, same rhythm, same distance between each sound. Thomas got out of bed and looked toward the hallway. Rebecca was already awake. She had heard it too. Neither spoke immediately because both were trying to determine what could have caused it. A branch could have fallen against the house. An animal could have moved onto the porch. The explanation seemed simple. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the front room. Before reaching the door, another sound came from outside. This time, it was not tapping, it was a voice. The voice called Thomas by his first name, not loudly, not urgently, just once. Thomas. The couple later told investigators that hearing his name was the moment everything changed. If it had been scratching, knocking, or an unknown noise, they could have explained it away. But the voice sounded like someone standing directly outside who expected him to answer. Thomas approached the window beside the front door and carefully looked through the curtain. The porch light illuminated the wooden steps and the fresh snow covering the ground. Nobody was visible. There were no footprints leading toward the house, no tire marks on the driveway, no movement anywhere around the property. The forest beyond the porch remained completely still. He turned away from the window and prepared to call the sheriff's department using the landline. Before he could reach the phone, the knocking started again. This time, it came from the back door. 3 slow knocks. Then, silence. Thomas and Rebecca stood in the hallway listening. The distance between the front door and the back door was only 30 feet. Whatever was outside had moved around the house without making any noticeable sound. No footsteps in the snow, no movement through the bushes, nothing. The couple remained inside for nearly 40 minutes without answering. During that time, the person or thing outside never attempted to force entry. There were no threats, no shouting, no repeated attempts to open the doors. Instead, the knocking continued at random intervals, sometimes from the front porch, sometimes from the back entrance. Occasionally from the side window near the kitchen, each time the same pattern repeated. 3 slow knocks followed by complete silence. At approximately 12:20, Rebecca noticed something unusual through the kitchen window. The snow-covered ground reflected the moonlight clearly enough that she could see the area beside the house. There were footprints near the window, but they did not lead toward the house. They appeared to begin directly beside the wall and continue several feet before disappearing beneath the snow. The couple finally contacted the county sheriff's office shortly after midnight. Due to the remote location and winter conditions, deputies did not arrive until nearly 45 minutes later. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the knocking had stopped. Thomas and Rebecca opened the door only after confirming the deputies were outside. The deputies searched the property immediately. They found no damaged doors, no broken windows, and no evidence that anyone had entered the home. The snow surrounding the farmhouse showed only the footprints of Thomas, Rebecca, and the deputies themselves. No additional tracks led away from the house. No vehicle tracks appeared on the gravel road. But one detail confused the deputies. The front porch had been cleared of snow before the storm. Near the center of the porch was a single wet handprint on the wooden railing. Not a footprint, not a glove mark, a handprint. And it was positioned too high to have been made by a child. The deputies photographed the mark, but by the following morning, the moisture had disappeared completely. No fingerprints were recovered, no suspect was identified. The official report classified the incident as an unknown person, possibly on private property. The investigation might have ended there if not for something discovered several weeks later. After the incident, Thomas and Rebecca became noticeably more cautious about their new home. They installed motion sensor lights around the property, purchased additional security cameras, and began keeping a detailed record of anything unusual that happened after sunset. At first, nothing else occurred. For nearly a month, the farmhouse returned to normal. The couple started believing the winter storm, combined with exhaustion and isolation, had caused them to misinterpret what happened that night. Then, on February 23rd, the cameras captured something that reopened every question. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, one of the motion sensors near the back porch activated. The camera recorded the snow-covered yard for nearly 30 minutes. No person appeared. No animal crossed the property. The image remained completely still. However, the audio recording captured 3 distinct knocks. 3 slow knocks against the back door. The same pattern. The same rhythm. The camera showed nobody standing outside. Thomas immediately contacted the sheriff's office again. This time, deputies reviewed the recording themselves. Unlike the first incident, there was now evidence that something had caused the sound. Yet, after examining the property, investigators found no explanation. The back door showed no damage, the porch area showed no footprints, the security camera itself had recorded no visible movement. The official report stated that the source of the knocking could not be determined. For most people, that would have been enough reason to leave. Thomas and Rebecca considered selling the farmhouse, but decided against it. They had invested too much time restoring the property, and they believed abandoning it would mean allowing fear to control their lives. Instead, they continued living there while taking additional precautions. But the following summer, another strange detail emerged. While cleaning the attic, Rebecca discovered a small wooden box hidden behind an old support beam. Inside were several photographs, handwritten letters, and documents belonging to the previous owners. Most items were ordinary family memories from decades earlier. One photograph caught her attention. It showed the farmhouse during the winter of 1986. The picture had been taken from the front yard. The house looked almost identical to how it appeared decades later. The porch, the windows, and the surrounding trees had changed very little. But written on the back of the photograph was a sentence that made Rebecca immediately contact the previous owner's family. January night, heard someone knocking. Nobody there. The photograph was dated January 12th, 1986. Nearly 30 years before Thomas and Rebecca experienced the same thing. The previous owner's daughter, Mary Whitaker, agreed to speak with Rebecca after learning why she contacted her. Mary explained that she was only 16 years old when her family lived in the farmhouse. She remembered one winter night when her father woke everyone after hearing someone calling his name from outside. At first, the family assumed it was a neighbor needing help. Her father opened the curtain and saw nothing. Then, the knocking moved to the back door. Exactly as it happened years later. Mary told Rebecca that her father searched the property with a flashlight but found no person, no footprints, and no explanation. The family never reported it because her father believed people in the community would think they were exaggerating. But that was not the only story. Mary revealed that her grandfather, who originally built the farmhouse in the 1950s, had experienced something similar decades earlier. He believed someone had been walking around the property at night because he repeatedly heard footsteps near the barn. Each time he checked, nothing was there. 3 generations. One house, the same mountain location. The same unexplained sounds after dark. Rebecca eventually asked Mary the question that had bothered her since the night of the incident. What do you think was outside? Mary's answer was simple. She said her family never believed it was someone trying to enter the house. They believed it was something that wanted to know if anyone inside would answer. After hearing that, Rebecca and Thomas decided they would no longer stay at the farmhouse during winter months. They kept the property, but spent the coldest part of the year with relatives in town. Years later, a local newspaper investigated several unusual reports from isolated Appalachian homes. Researchers found similar stories throughout the region. Families describing knocks at empty doors, voices calling names from outside, sounds moving around houses without leaving visible evidence. Most reports had reasonable explanations. Wild animals, old buildings settling, wind patterns, neighbors making mistakes. But a small number remained unresolved because investigators could not explain one specific detail. The witnesses were not frightened because they heard something unusual. They were frightened because whatever happened seemed to know exactly where they were. Today, the farmhouse still stands on that quiet Appalachian hillside. The road leading there remains narrow, surrounded by thick forest and distant mountains. The current owners have never reported anything unusual, or at least they have never reported it publicly. Because in many small Appalachian communities, there are certain stories people tell only after they know you have lived there long enough. Stories about strange nights, empty roads, and moments when someone standing outside your door knows your name before you ever open it. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the Carter family's story is not that something came to their door that winter night. It is that when they checked the old records, they discovered it had been waiting at that same door for generations. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if these shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch mountain range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archive notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archive notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. In this news story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the 2 researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or a transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the 9th night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archive notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archived notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archived notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. For 20 years, nobody entered this Appalachian cabin. Deep in the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, an abandoned cabin sat completely undisturbed for 2 decades. During the early spring of 2020, a determined property appraiser finally unlocked the heavy front door. What he discovered inside the dusty, rotting structure remains a highly debated topic among regional law enforcement today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing scene that defies simple logical explanation. 45-year-old Robert Hayes worked as a highly experienced municipal property appraiser for the rural county. His primary professional objective required him to evaluate abandoned, secluded estates for upcoming public tax auction property sales. The county file from 2009 mentioned a highly unstable structural foundation regarding this specific isolated property. He safely arrived on April 4th and immediately began carefully assessing the severely overgrown exterior of the structure. The first hour of his standard inspection passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents or unexpected safety hazards. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures for that entire calm afternoon. However, Robert distinctly heard strange, heavy dragging sounds echoing slowly from the upper floor of the abandoned cabin. He initially assumed a large wild animal was aggressively building a nesting den inside the warm, dry attic. When he cautiously shouted a loud verbal warning, the heavy dragging sounds instantly ceased in the dusty darkness. Robert quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive, deep indentations on the original hardwood floor completely inside. The strange, unexplainable tracks were perfectly smooth in shape, and they pressed heavily into the solid oak planks. Some locals claimed a rogue drifter occasionally used the abandoned structure to hide stolen heavy commercial mining equipment. Investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors and firmly maintained the property was completely securely locked prior. Robert carefully photographed the bizarre, smooth floor damage and noted the stride length indicated a massive, heavy object. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously throughout the entire floor. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. The dedicated appraiser immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed room. Robert quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff that day. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and partially collapsed the wooden staircase. Robert scrambled frantically toward the dark open hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense dark mass standing perfectly still near the broken attic hatch. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient light filtering indoors. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Afternoon light quickly clearly revealed that his specialized digital measurement equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Robert frantically, urgently decided he absolutely needed to abandon his remaining inspection gear and hike toward his truck. He soon realized his reliable backup analog compass was constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable, heavy magnetic directional headings. He was effectively completely disoriented inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently confusing, highly experienced outdoorsmen. The desperate, anxious appraiser decided to blindly, consistently follow the overgrown driveway path, hoping it safely intersected pavement. He hiked for 2 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched. Archived notes from Robert stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected rest stop briefly. He huddled tightly, safely against a large oak tree while strongly clutching his sturdy walking stick for protection. Around late afternoon, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent, as wild birds completely stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath him. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially found nothing. Robert frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the battery died. He screamed out loudly in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack him, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Robert slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange safety whistle, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly rattled his internal chest. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black panic, the terrified appraiser blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, dense woods. He hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the thick, tangled brush until he eventually physically collapsed near the highway. A commercial delivery truck driver miraculously happily found Robert wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel shoulder. The older traumatized appraiser was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by branches. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden cabin doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. The intense subsequent official police investigation failed to produce any logical, rational, scientific answers regarding the strange destruction. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected a highly aggressive local squatter had simply violently rigged the deserted property. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy wooden framing was completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Robert permanently fully abandoned his promising county property appraisal career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable cabin experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, he deeply severely suffered from chronic daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The actual, true, physical nature of what currently securely resides deep inside that rugged Appalachian cabin remains unspoken. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely, completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly, entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials firmly suspected the quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained totally, officially unsolved. Lisa permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain thoroughly uncharted and heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total, highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness successfully transformed reality. Archive notes thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains officially contested. University biology science experts permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange, bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient predatory anomalies. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed the sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden end sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty, and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirmed that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12th, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife, Alara, and their young daughter, Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all 3 cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland Silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. The whispering ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift, as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, all 4 men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods, except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lin abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lin crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lin standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lin turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lin remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining 3 men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all 4 men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by 2 local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lin never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium, where he continued to insist, until his death, that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, the canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for 4 forgotten men. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain back roads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine. Arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow two-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark.